Hello, my name is Jordy Izzard. I am Senior Associate Director of SAIS Alumni Relations, and today's date is January 16th, 2015, and I am here today with Paul Borsuk, who graduated as an ABMA from Johns Hopkins undergraduate and SAIS in 1970. And we're so happy to have you today, and we're just going to have a bit of a conversation. And why don't we start with what originally brought you to SAIS?
Well, what originally brought me to SAIS was a different color page in a Johns Hopkins catalog in a filing cabinet in a high school library full of college catalogs. And I was already interested in political science and international relations as I was attending high school in the Midwest. And since the internet was yet to come upon us, one thought about what college one was going to go to by rummaging in drawers full of college catalogs. In this case, it was a little incomprehensible since I was doing this probably within 15 blocks of the campus of the University of Wisconsin, where every other member of my family, past and present and future, has gone. But I had to put on airs, and I took the catalog in my hand of Johns Hopkins University and saw, what is this yellow page among all the white pages? And it was an announcement that one could apply for the bachelor's, master's 5-year program in international relations. And I thought that was just a marvelous idea, since that would help me change the world. I didn't entertain that notion too long, but would give me an accelerated credential and put me in the right place. And so I managed to go ahead with that plan. I had decided, even though I wasn't initially admitted to the 5-year program, but was admitted as an undergraduate, we'll go to Baltimore anyway. And then within a week, a letter came and said, okay, there's been some movement in the roster, and we can put you on the varsity as far as the 5-year program is concerned. And so 3 years in Baltimore, 2 years in Washington, and as I have said, I got what I came for.
That's great. And what are some of your memories of being a student at SAIS?
Well, this was from 1968 to 1970, and so some of my memories are going to reflect the awareness of what was going on in Washington, D.C., and in the larger world at the time. Let me say up front, my memories of the academic experience are generally very positive, certainly as far as the professors who taught the primary courses. I actually learned something about international economics, which I thought I was a complete dunce. I was proud and learned to study with and learn a lot from Herbert Dinnerstein, who was overseeing the Soviet studies and element of the program at that time, and a number of other professors, and finally learned something about the Russian language after having learned nothing up in Baltimore, since there was no Russian department, but this was my interest. Instructors from The Voice of America, some really motivated, knowledgeable instructors. So if I was going to make any progress at all, I was the despair of them. I'm a poor student of foreign languages, but I did make genuine forward motion. That said, Washington, D.C., and a country at war, that generates a lot of memories. I think the one that I would mention first has to do with my being on working a shift as circulation assistant, desk assistant at the library one evening. We would work until 10 o'clock in the top floor of the old building. And getting a call from my wife, we were living at that time out in Arlington, with what you'd call really, really good news. And the really, really good news was that in that evening's selection of draft lottery numbers, my birthday was number 323, which meant that we could get on with the rest of our lives without my facing induction into the United States Armed Forces at a time when that was probably not a really happy thing to be experiencing. So that will always be one of my memories. Also that spring, and here I'm talking about another member of the ABMA class, someone who, by the name of Thomas J. Kaufman, who had come through all 3 years with us in Baltimore and had was a little more hot-headed and a little less disciplined maybe than some of us. And at some point, I think during our 4th year, during the year concluding in the spring of 1969, dropped out and went into the Army. And I had heard as we went through the 69-70 year that he was in officer candidate school down at Fort Benning in Georgia. And I walked into the building, 1740 Mass Avenue Northwest, one day in the winter of the 69-70 year, and there was Jay sitting in the coffee room, sitting in the small cafeteria there with a couple of friends, other members of the group. So I expressed some amazement, like, what the heck are you doing here? And he explained that he had found an experience of being trained to be a second lieutenant and lead a platoon, hadn't agreed with him very much, and he'd tried to wash out, and those responsible for overseeing his experience had said, "We're not letting you out of this quite so easily. You can, we're going to change your attitude, we're going to change your mental makeup." So he did the one thing that he knew would wash him out of OCS, and that's to go AWOL for longer than 72 hours, so here he was in Washington. I said to Jay Kaufman, "You better keep going north, because they're going to know exactly what to do with you, and you're going to come back in a bag." And instead it was, for whatever, perhaps incomprehensible, who knows the motives of another, that afternoon Jay headed out to Fort Myer, turned himself into the Provost Marshal, was shipped back to Fort Benning, washed out of OCS, but because of all his superb combat readiness, was sent right over as a replacement to that part of the Republic of Vietnam that we call the A Shau Valley, and he was killed in action shortly afterwards. I came walking into school. This was in April and May 1970, time of Kent State and so on. Came walking into the building, and another member of the group who roomed with Jay came out and said, "Borsuk, you were right. He's coming back in a bag." 2 days after that, George Pugh, the other member of the group who had roomed with Jay, received his last letter, written from the field, in which he described the situation and said some rather disparaging things. And this was at a time when there was a lot of tumult, and I asked Betty Beecham, the registrar at that time, "Can I borrow a typewriter?"
We have her interview
computers.
as well. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
And typed the letter, and it was put up on the board. And some people thought this was a good thing to do, and some people thought this was a bad thing to do. He thought he was in an incompetently led platoon, and they'd gone through the same ambush 3 times because the platoon leader was not educable about what kind of situation they were in, and then he was KIA. That was at the same time, to put this back in the academic context, I was taking a seminar that was being offered by Morton Halpern, who was coming across the street from Brookings, just at the time that the list of people whose phones had been wiretapped at the behest of Henry Kissinger, Morton Halpern having been full-time and then a consultant to the National Security Council at that time. Morton Halpern's name was on that list, and this is in the midst of immense turbulence. He comes into class a little bit late and says, "All right, you can ask me anything except about one person. Do not ask me anything about Henry Kissinger." Learned a lot from Morton Halpern. It was in Morton Halpern's class that we read in manuscript form what became Graham Ellison's book, Essence of Decision, and that would be one of the most influential books. I saw something recently, people were supposed to talk about the influential books. Well, that was an influential book on my thinking. And so on and so on. Helmut Sonnenfeld invited 4 or 5 people, and I managed to get included, to come down, because he was teaching Soviet foreign policy at the time, but his office, because he was working closely with Henry Kissinger, was in the old executive office building. So we went down there, got let through the gate at a time when there were all manner of public demonstrations and so on. And I think, unfortunately, I was the only student in the group who actually wanted to ask, "What's going on? What are you thinking?" Instead, everybody wanted to vent. And I don't consider venting, generally, a particularly productive activity, only in the most extraordinary circumstances. But that kind of puts it in a bundle. Living in a city that was still displaying a lot of damage from the riots of 1968. At one point, this was in November of 1969. I'm pleased to report that I did not have my brains blown out. I was in there were 7 of us living together in a row house. It's now a very elegant residence, but at that time it was scheduled to be torn down for a freeway that was never built on 19th Street, 19th and R, 1714 19th. And so 7 of us, all ABMA, all living in that house, and so everybody had responsibility for groceries and cooking on one night. And so I was shopping in what was then a small Safeway in the shadow of the Washington Hilton, about 20th and S, just coming up to the cash register when 3 angry gentlemen held up the place. And so I had to drop to the floor and someone looks down from what looked to be about 20,000 feet with what turns out to have been probably an antiquated revolver. Again, firearms has advanced seriously in our country since that time, and said, "You get the bleep out of there." And so I kind of bounced on my hindquarters to get out of his way so he could empty the register, and then off they went. The police later suggested it was probably not even an operational firearm. So, in fact, I was in no danger at all. I thought so at the time, and of course that's kind of one of those experiences where you say, well, things may seem tumultuous now, but it was a little different then. But the educational purpose of it all, mastering a certain body of knowledge and being professionally qualified to do something useful, that remained intact through all of this.
That's great. And what about when you first graduated? How did your career start, and then how did it evolve?
Well, that again has to do with SAIS. And not so much, well, I guess you'd say it was a serious placement effort. A 3x5 card on the bulletin board in what I think I would call the basement of the school. Sometime around March of 1970, March of 1969, end of my first year, said that anyone wishing to speak to representatives of the United States Central Intelligence Agency who would be interested in providing information about summer internship should come to a certain time and place. I and several other people responded to that opportunity, so I became a very junior member of the intelligence community for the summer of 1969, just having gotten married, and then again in the summer of 1970, and that was pretty useful. What I did do, though, I went to, I wanted to go into a doctoral program, and I went up to Columbia, to the Russian Institute. To make a long story short, I spent some really fascinating years there and doing some really striking things, but did not complete. I am an ABD, I am an all but dissertation candidate from Columbia University. At one point, I went to see Professor Dinnerstein because I had been admitted with little or no financial aid to Columbia, but the academic establishment in my hometown at the University of Wisconsin had admitted me as a doctoral candidate with somewhat more in the way of financial aid. So I went to get advice from Herb Dinnerstein, and he said something that has stuck with me because I've used it numerous times since. He said, before you go any further, I just kind of briefly outlined it, but before you go any further, I'm going to say to you what I say to everybody in the same situation. If there's something that you already want to hear me say, that's what I want you to do. And that can have a very clarifying effect. I wanted to go up to New York. I wanted to find a way to do it. And he said, and then, of course, I'm going to go on and give you the best advice I can, but that's the first thing I want to tell you. Well, I did go to New York. We did manage to make ends meet. My wife Ann went to, who was a Goucher College graduate. We were classical Hopkins Goucher romance, and we're still keeping company on a regular basis 45 years later. Get me started, I'll start telling you about my 4.5-month-old twin grandchildren and their older brother and all this sort of stuff. She went to library school at Columbia. We made it through. She went to work for Columbia. But then this was a particularly bad environment there in the early 70s for getting academic jobs, and that's when I gravitated toward a return to federal service. And that's when I became a career trainee with that same United States Central Intelligence Agency and spent several years there in a variety of capacities. And that has had great value, even though I left the organization in 1985 using a conglomeration or an amalgamation of skills and elicited aptitudes that come both from this government service and from the education that various people were good enough to provide me with. Been able to earn a regular living. There have been a few disruptions here and now. I was working for a financial services firm doing the kind of job I'm doing now, and that financial services firm disappeared beneath the waves as surely as the Titanic went down. That was the accounting firm of Arthur Andersen in the Enron aftermath. Fortunately, I now work for another firm doing the non-financial, the thing that I do, which, not to burn up a lot of video time here, involves quiet and thorough due diligence inquiries regarding people and enterprises with which we might do business before we actually start to do business with them. What should we really know before we open this professional engagement that will mean we have certain obligations and certain potential legal liabilities? I want someone to walk point on this, to use a expression from our Southeast Asian experience. I once had a boss back at Arthur Andersen who said, I've got any number of people who can give me a stack of paper this high on something I need to know about. What I really need is someone who can give me a stack of paper about this high with 1 or 2 pages on top to tell me what's there. I said, I can do that. And among the part of the fuel in the tank that enables me to do that is what I learned at SAIS.
That's great. And does that take us up to today?
Pretty much.
Okay.
That's where we're sitting right now.
Okay.
I can't think of anything terribly exciting without beginning to talk about my children, the excitement of the past week. I mean, again, this is the sort of career consciousness that students today at SAIS have to have. My son, we have 3 children. My son is the eldest, my son Ken. He made the choice, as other members of my family have, and it's sort of collateral to my profession, to become a journalist. So on the first business day of the current year, we get a call from him that he's the editor and lead reporter of a weekly paper in Greenwich, Connecticut. They're closing my paper. The company is shutting it down. That is a particular occupational hazard in a lot of professions. I mean, that's why government work had then in my time and has now an appeal, simply because it can't often happen quite as cataclysmically. I'm glad to report to you and anyone who will view this that my son, with the help of some good fortune and his record of having been very good at what he does there in that community, caught a new job with another media organization.
Great.
Right there, publishes a daily paper in Greenwich, and so we don't have to, right away anyway, have him moving back into his old room, which is ready for him if he needs it. Also true, since we've stayed in the same house, either of my daughters can do the same, but they're pretty well established.
That's great. Well, congratulations, yeah.
Well, it's, the grandchildren are now living about 5 minutes away. The family moved to a place big enough for them from here in New York City where they'd been living. So they may be getting a little bit too much of mom and a little bit too much of dad, but on the other hand, having 3 kids, 3 years and younger, reinforcements are welcome from any source, not to mention that they're the 3 most brilliant, accomplished, even at 4.5 months, the twins are obviously headed toward numerous professional awards and high compensation, I'm quite sure.
That's great. That's great. Well, and one other thing, given your illustrious career, this is really great.
That illustrious is in air quotes, yes.
I know. Tell us maybe what advice you might have for current students today.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm going to end up quoting Gilbert and Sullivan from HMS Pinafore. Stick close to your desk and never go to sea, and you may someday be ruler of the Queen's Navy. On a more serious note, I don't know that I have a full grasp. I make it a point to at least scan the content of alumni materials that come around and the great big annual SAIS. I mean, I was just setting out recycling, and one of the things I kept, because I've kept for a couple of years, the annual in which it's, I think, the Development Office and on religion as a conflict issue in the world, and worth keeping. Didn't put it out to be picked up. There's such a strange balance that wasn't an issue when I was a student. A strange balance between one's professional or commercial advantage and then one's desire to be an undercompensated but brave and ultimately successful combatant against some of the transnational, supranational new issues, whether it's global health, whether it's global development, whether it's global education. And maybe it just shows that I'm getting old and cranky, but I feel that SAIS wouldn't be doing its job and SAIS students wouldn't be mastering the grasp of reality that they need to have if they don't fully familiarize themselves, don't achieve the fluency they need to have with the pervasiveness of conflict, with the reality of conflict in this world. And the terms of that, I'm a child of the Cold War. I'm an acolyte of the Cold War national security state. So as you can imagine, there have been plenty of times in the last decade or two when I've got some newspaper or some television going in front of me, and I'm just giggling like a 4-year-old because all of this is so totally implausible. And now suddenly I find myself digging for materials about Russia that smell as musty as this SAIS catalog from 1970-71 that has my picture in it, because somehow everything, like the old jazz standard says, everything old is new again. And yet this against the context of a style of conflict, a purification conflict. I don't want to get into a discussion of whether we should refer to it as jihadism or Islamic terrorism and so on. From a domestic political point of view, I find this manipulative and really appalling. But there's a sense of tragedy, and that's not an expression I thought of before a second ago, a sense of tragedy and what an educated person, an educated, motivated person can do to maintain hope even when that sense of tragedy takes its toll, that someone who's becoming involved in international affairs in any capacity and getting credentialed at SAIS should have. It shouldn't be paralytic. It shouldn't lead to despair. I have this advice for just not only SAIS students, but everybody I know. For God's sake, keep your sense of humor. But to have that kind of grasp of the face of the enemy, whether the enemy is something that can be personified or described, or whether the enemy is just a form of human conduct that takes glee in mindless destruction. You got to grasp. You got to grasp nothing. You got to grasp nihilism before you achieve an understanding of what can be constructively brought about in a global environment, or for that matter in our own country. And maybe that's where I would put a dot at the end of it.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate all
It's
you
been
do
my
for
pleasure.
SAIS in the
Thank
world,
you.
and thank you for this interview.
Definitely my pleasure. Thanks.